Most animals age quickly, decline rapidly, and disappear soon after reproduction. Humans do the opposite. Our bodies weaken slowly, over decades, long after we are biologically useful. In evolutionary terms, this is strange. Nature usually removes what no longer serves survival. Yet humans remain alive while their strength fades, their cells accumulate damage, and their bodies quietly deteriorate year after year. This slow aging is often described as a gift, but evolution rarely gives gifts without a cost. If aging slowly was never the norm in nature, why did humans become the exception? And what did we lose in order to gain so much time? Slow aging feels familiar to us because we live inside it. But in nature, it is not the norm. Most living creatures do not move gently from youth into old age. They rise quickly, reach maturity, reproduce, and then disappear. Their decline is not gradual or reflective. It is brief, functional, and often abrupt. From the perspective of evolution, this pattern is not cruel. It is efficient. What matters is not how long a body lasts, but whether it successfully passes its genes to the next generation. Once that task is completed, there is little pressure for the body to remain intact. In many species, the period after reproduction is short or almost non-existent. Aging, as humans experience it, barely exists. When we place humans inside this broader biological landscape, our pattern immediately stands out. We accumulate damage year after year, sometimes for decades, while remaining alive long after reproduction has ended. This alone makes human aging an anomaly rather than a baseline. To understand why this matters, it helps to step away from human intuition and look at how evolution usually works. Natural selection does not design organisms to feel time. It does not favor reflection, memory, or extended decline. It favors speed, efficiency, and replacement. In environments where predation, disease, and scarcity dominate, long life is often a disadvantage. A body that lasts too long consumes resources without contributing new offspring. A population that renews itself quickly adapts faster. From this angle, short lives are not a failure of biology. They are its default solution. This is why aging in most animals is compressed. Damage accumulates, but it is never meant to be managed for long. Cells are not optimized for decades of maintenance. Repair mechanisms are just good enough to reach reproduction. Beyond that point, selection weakens. There is no strong evolutionary reward for preserving tissues, preventing slow degeneration, or avoiding late-life disease. The body is allowed to fail because its role has already been fulfilled. Humans break this pattern. We remain alive in a prolonged state of gradual decline. Our muscles weaken, our immune systems lose precision, our cells accumulate errors, yet the organism continues. From an evolutionary perspective, this raises a quiet question. Why was this allowed to happen? Or more precisely, why was it not strongly selected against? The answer does not begin with wisdom, culture, or medicine. It begins with recognizing that slow aging is not something evolution set out to create. It is not a goal. It is a byproduct. Humans did not evolve to age slowly because slow aging was useful on its own. It emerged because other traits required time, and the body was pulled along with them. In this first step of the story, it is enough to hold one idea gently. Human aging is unusual not because we are especially well designed, but because we are unusually prolonged. Compared to almost every other animal, we do not exit the stage when our primary biological task is complete. We linger. This anomaly does not yet tell us why it happened, or what it cost. It only tells us that human aging should not be treated as a standard reference point. It is a deviation, and deviations, in evolution, always carry consequences that unfold slowly, over time. When we speak about aging, we often imagine it as a universal process that simply unfolds at different speeds. In reality, Aging takes many forms, and in most species, it is barely visible because life ends before long decline can occur. Many animals do not experience a prolonged period of weakness or deterioration. Instead, their bodies are shaped around a narrow window of performance. Growth is fast, maturity is brief, and physical breakdown follows soon after. This pattern is not accidental. It reflects how natural selection distributes energy. Maintaining a body is costly. Repairing cells, stabilizing DNA, regulating inflammation, and preserving organ function all require continuous investment. In species with short lives, evolution chooses not to pay that cost for long. Resources are redirected toward growth and reproduction instead. Once those goals are met, there is little reason, in evolutionary terms. This helps explain why slow aging is so rare. It demands long-term maintenance, and long-term maintenance only makes sense when there is a return on that investment. In most animals, there is not. Their survival depends on speed, camouflage, numbers, or rapid reproduction, not on longevity. A long life would not significantly increase reproductive success, and could even reduce it by slowing population turnover. As a result, their bodies are allowed to deteriorate quickly once reproduction is complete. Humans, however, do not follow this energetic logic cleanly. Our bodies invest heavily in maintenance well beyond the reproductive years. Cells continue repairing themselves. Organs resist failure longer than expected. Even when systems begin to decline, they do so gradually rather than collapsing. This creates the long arc of aging that feels normal to us, but is highly unusual when placed alongside other species. What makes this especially striking is that humans did not evolve in safe or stable environments. Early human life was harsh, filled with injury, infection, and scarcity. Under such conditions, one would expect selection to favor short, efficient lifespans. Yet the opposite pattern slowly emerged. This suggests that slow aging was not selected because it was ideal, but because it was difficult to eliminate without losing something else that mattered more. The body could not simply be optimized for early reproduction and then discarded, because the human way of surviving depended on traits that unfolded over long periods. At this stage, it is important not to romanticize longevity. Slow aging does not mean the body is free from damage. It means damage is managed rather than avoided. Wear accumulates quietly, year after year, until it becomes visible. In many animals, this accumulation happens too quickly to observe. In humans, it stretches across decades. This stretching creates the illusion that aging is a controlled process. In reality, it is a prolonged compromise. Evolution did not perfect the human body for long life. It tolerated long life because removing it would have disrupted other critical functions. This reframes aging from a sign of biological success into a sign of biological tension. Humans persist in a state that most organisms never reach, not because it is efficient, but because the path evolution took left no clean alternative. This perspective prepares us to look more closely at the specific traits that force time to become essential for human survival. To complete this first axis, it helps to return to the central contrast that frames the entire discussion. In most animals, life is organized around a clear biological priority. The body is built to perform intensely for a short period, then fade. There is no long transition, no extended phase of maintenance without purpose. Survival either leads quickly to reproduction or ends altogether. This simplicity is not primitive. It is highly refined. It allows populations to renew themselves rapidly and adapt to changing environments. Aging, in this context, is not a drawn-out experience. It is compressed into the final moments of life, often hidden behind predation or sudden failure. Humans, by contrast, carry their decline with them. This long middle state, neither fully strong nor immediately failing, is rare in nature. It exists because the human body was never allowed to follow the usual evolutionary shortcut. Traits that mattered for survival unfolded slowly and required time to mature, express, and stabilize. Once time became essential, the body could no longer be disposable after reproduction. It had to persist, even if imperfectly. This persistence did not come from superior biological engineering. When a species becomes dependent on long development, learning, and coordination, removing the later stages of life becomes risky. The body must be kept running, even as damage accumulates. Aging, in humans, is the visible trace of this compromise. It is not an adaptation in itself, but the side effect of adaptations that demanded endurance. Seen this way, slow aging stops looking like an advantage and starts looking like a footprint. It marks where evolution was forced to stretch a fragile design across more years than it was originally meant to handle. This does not yet explain which traits created that pressure, only that once time entered the equation, it could not be taken back. Human aging is slow because human survival became slow. It unfolded across years rather than moments, relationships rather than reflexes, memory rather than instinct. In most species, once the biological task is complete, the body exits the system. In humans, the task expanded beyond reproduction alone. The body remained, not because it was finished, but because the process was still ongoing. This closes the first step of the story. It is the result of something deeper, something that required time in a world where time is usually a liability. To understand why humans were pulled so far from the biological norm, we must now look at how nature typically designs lives to be short and why that design usually works so well. To understand why short lives dominate the natural world, we must set aside the human desire for longevity and look instead at what evolution consistently rewards. Natural selection does not measure success in years lived. It measures success in genes passed on. Any trait that increases the likelihood of reproduction tends to spread, even if it shortens life afterward. From this perspective, a long lifespan is only valuable when it directly improves reproductive success. If it does not, it becomes an unnecessary expense. Most environments are unpredictable and hostile. Predators, parasites, climate shifts, and competition create constant pressure. Under these conditions, speed matters more than endurance. An organism that grows quickly, reproduces early, and leaves many offspring can succeed even if each individual body is fragile. In fact, fragility can be tolerated because replacement is frequent. This is why short lifespans are not an accident of nature. They are a recurring solution. Evolution favors designs that are just strong enough to complete their task, not strong enough to last indefinitely. Every additional year of maintenance costs energy. Cells must repair damage, regulate internal balance, and prevent uncontrolled growth. These processes divert resources away from growth and reproduction. In species where early reproduction is possible, investing heavily in long-term maintenance offers little return. Selection, therefore, weakens rapidly after reproductive age. Traits that cause slow decline or late-life disease are not strongly removed because they appear after genes have already been passed on. Over generations, this creates bodies that function well early and fail quickly later. This pattern explains why many animals seem to age all at once. They do not suddenly become weak because something goes wrong. They were never selected to remain strong for long. Their biology is front-loaded. Humans often misinterpret this as animals being spared the burden of aging. In reality, aging is simply compressed into a short window that we rarely observe. The animal does not live long enough for gradual decline to unfold. Its body reaches a tipping point and collapses. This is not a flaw. It is an efficient alignment between biology and environment. Short lives also allow faster evolutionary change. When generations turn over quickly, populations adapt more rapidly to new threats. Mutations spread or disappear faster. A species that replaces itself often can track a changing environment more closely than one that persists unchanged for decades. Longevity slows this process. It stabilizes individuals at the cost of flexibility. For most species, flexibility is more valuable than stability. This is why long-lived organisms are rare and often constrained to specific niches where survival depends less on speed and more on persistence. Seen through this lens, human longevity begins to look even stranger. Our ancestors lived in environments that were neither safe nor stable. There was no obvious ecological reason for natural selection to favor long life. Yet the human lineage drifted away from the short-life solution that worked so well for others. This suggests that something in human survival strategy interfered with the usual logic. Something made early reproduction alone insufficient. Something made time itself valuable. Before identifying that force, it is essential to fully appreciate how deeply evolution is biased toward short, efficient lives. Only then can we understand what kind of pressure is strong enough to push a species in the opposite direction. Even when some animals do live longer than average, their longevity usually follows strict boundaries. It is not open-ended, and it is rarely accompanied by a long period of gradual decline. Instead, these species tend to maintain function for most of their lives and then deteriorate rapidly at the end. This pattern reflects a different kind of efficiency. Rather than investing in slow repair over decades, the body prioritizes stability up to a certain point and then fails once accumulated damage crosses a threshold. In evolutionary terms, this approach is cheaper than constant maintenance. It allows the organism to perform reliably during its useful years, without paying the long-term cost of keeping every system flexible and repairable indefinitely. This distinction matters because it highlights how unusual the human pattern truly is. Humans do not maintain peak function and then collapse. We gradually lose strength, resilience, and precision. Our decline is extended, uneven, and often unpredictable. This suggests that our biology is not optimized for either short life or clean longevity. It is stretched between two incompatible demands. To see why, we must look again at how selection weakens with age. Once reproduction has occurred, the force of selection declines sharply. Harmful traits that appear late in life can persist because they do not prevent reproduction. Over time, this creates bodies that are robust early but increasingly vulnerable later. In most species, this vulnerability is hidden because life ends quickly. In humans, it becomes visible because life continues. Slow aging is therefore not a sign that selection favored old age. It is a sign that selection failed to remove late-acting problems once time became available. This creates a body that survives long enough for its weaknesses to surface. The longer the lifespan, the more clearly these weaknesses appear. What makes humans distinctive is not that we escaped this rule, but that we exposed it. By extending life beyond the usual limits, human biology reveals the underlying compromises that evolution normally conceals. Degeneration, disease, and decline are not new problems. They are old problems that usually remain unseen. Another reason evolution favors short lives is that it reduces the accumulation of internal conflict. Cells compete, mutations arise, and errors increase with time. Long-lived bodies must constantly suppress these conflicts through complex regulation. This requires energy and introduces new risks, such as cancer or autoimmune breakdown. In short-lived species, these conflicts often do not have time to escalate. Ending life earlier avoids them altogether. From this perspective, longevity is not a simple advantage. It is a management problem. The longer a body persists, the more effort it must devote to controlling processes that naturally drift toward disorder. For most species, avoiding this problem entirely is the simpler solution. Humans, however, crossed a threshold where avoidance was no longer possible. Life extended far enough that these conflicts became unavoidable, and the body was forced to manage them imperfectly. This deepens the puzzle rather than resolving it. If short lives are efficient, flexible, and safe from long-term internal failure, why did humans abandon this strategy? Why did our lineage accept the burden of prolonged decline instead of following the cleaner biological path that dominates nature? To approach that question, we must now examine what happens when a species enters evolution with a body that is already fragile, slow, and poorly suited to rapid survival, yet continues to persist anyway. The final piece of this axis is to recognize that evolution does not choose between long life and short life in isolation. It chooses strategies that fit an entire way of surviving. Short lifespans dominate because they align cleanly with environments where danger is constant and prediction is difficult. In such worlds, investing in a body meant to last decades offers little benefit. Survival depends on quick maturation, early reproduction, and frequent replacement. A species that delays these steps risks disappearing before its genes ever spread. This is why so many animals are born ready, grow fast, and reach independence quickly. Their lives are compressed because compression increases the chance that at least some individuals succeed. Longevity, by contrast, only becomes valuable when survival depends less on speed and more on continuity. This is rare in nature. Most ecosystems punish slowness. They reward flexibility, numbers, and turnover. When conditions change, a population with short generations adapts faster. Errors are corrected more quickly. Successful traits spread without being diluted by long-lived individuals carrying outdated adaptations. From this perspective, short life is not just efficient at the individual level. It is efficient at the population level. It keeps evolution responsive. Long-lived organisms slow this process. They stabilize traits for longer periods, reducing the pace of change. For most of evolutionary history, volatility has been the rule rather than the exception. This makes the human case even more puzzling. Early humans did not inhabit unusually stable environments. They faced climate shifts, resource uncertainty, and constant threat. Yet their lineage did not double down on speed. Instead, it gradually tolerated longer development, longer dependence, and eventually longer lives. This suggests that human survival began to rely on something that could not be rushed. Something that made continuity more valuable than turnover. At this point, the logic of short lives reaches its limit. It explains why most species age quickly or not at all. It explains why slow aging is costly, risky, and usually avoided. What it cannot explain is why a fragile, slow, poorly equipped primate moved in the opposite direction and survived. That question cannot be answered by lifespan alone. It requires looking at the kind of body humans entered evolution with, and why that body could not simply follow the efficient, short-lived design that worked for almost every other animal. With this, the second axis closes. We have seen that nature strongly favors short, efficient lives, and that long life introduces biological tension rather than clarity. If humans nonetheless drifted towards slow aging, it was not because the strategy was superior in general, but because abandoning it was no longer possible. The next step is to examine the human body itself at the moment it entered this evolutionary path, and to understand why it was uniquely vulnerable, slow, and dependent in a world that rarely tolerates such traits. When humans first appear in the evolutionary record, there is nothing about their bodies that suggests longevity. Early humans were not large, not fast, and not especially strong. Compared to many animals around them, they were physically unimpressive. Their muscles were modest, their claws absent, their teeth unspecialized. Even their endurance, often celebrated, came with limits. Injuries healed slowly. Infections were dangerous. Childbirth was risky. From a purely biological standpoint, this was not a body designed to last. If evolution had followed its usual logic, such a fragile design would have benefited from a short, efficient life cycle. Yet this did not happen. Instead, the human body entered evolution already burdened with weakness and dependency, and still began to stretch across longer spans of time. This is the core tension of the human story. Humans did not become long-lived because their bodies were robust. They became long-lived despite the fact that their bodies were not. This forces us to reconsider the starting conditions. The human lineage did not begin with an optimized organism that later extended its lifespan. It began with a compromised body that survived by other means. Upright posture, for example, freed the hands but destabilized the spine and pelvis. Larger brains improved cognition but increased energy demands and prolonged childhood. Reduced body hair improved temperature regulation but increased vulnerability. Each step solved one problem while creating another. The human body accumulated trade-offs faster than it accumulated protections. In most species, such a pattern would be fatal. Weakness without speed or armor usually leads to extinction. Humans avoided this outcome not by fixing their bodies, but by altering the context in which those bodies operated. Survival shifted away from individual physical performance toward shared strategies. Cooperation, learning, and tool use began to compensate for biological deficits. These strategies did not eliminate fragility. They made fragility manageable. However, they also imposed a new requirement: time. Learning how to use tools, how to navigate social relationships, how to read the environment, and how to transmit knowledge could not be rushed. These processes unfolded slowly, across years rather than weeks. Once survival depended on slow acquisition rather than immediate readiness, the body could no longer be disposable after reproduction. It had to remain present long enough for those investments to pay off. This is where aging quietly enters the picture. The human body was not redesigned to become durable. It was simply kept alive longer than its original design anticipated. Maintenance systems were pushed to function beyond their initial scope. Damage that would normally remain hidden in a short life began to surface. Decline stretched out. Aging became visible. From this perspective, slow aging is not a feature added to the human body. It is the consequence of a fragile body being carried forward in time, because removing it too early would undermine the very strategies that made survival possible. To understand why humans age slowly, we must therefore stop looking for signs of biological perfection. The answer lies in biological compromise. The next step is to examine how slow development, especially in early life, locked the human lineage into this extended timeline and made time itself an essential resource rather than a liability. Slow development is one of the most defining features of the human body, and it begins at birth. Compared to other mammals, human infants are remarkably unprepared. They cannot walk, feed themselves, or protect their bodies. Their brains are unfinished, their muscles weak, their coordination incomplete. This extended dependency is often explained as a cost of having a large brain, but that explanation only scratches the surface. What matters evolutionarily is not just that development is slow, but that survival depends on it being slow. They absorb language, social rules, tool use, and environmental knowledge over many years. These skills cannot be encoded fully in genes. This shifts the burden of survival away from instinct and toward memory. Once learning becomes essential, time becomes valuable. Selection, therefore, begins to favor persistence, not because old age is useful in itself, but because premature loss becomes costly. This creates a subtle but powerful pressure. The body must remain functional long enough for learning to translate into survival benefits. Early human life was dangerous, and many individuals did not reach adulthood. But for those who did, extending life even slightly increased the return on years of accumulated knowledge. Over generations, this dynamic nudged the lineage toward longer lives, not through direct selection for longevity, but through selection against early loss. The body was not optimized for durability, it was simply prevented from exiting too soon. This is why human aging feels like a prolonged struggle rather than a clean design. Damage control became ongoing rather than temporary. The result was not agelessness, but gradual decline. Importantly, this slow aging did not eliminate vulnerability. It redistributed it across time. Instead of failing early and completely, the body began to fail slowly and partially. Strength faded, resilience dropped, errors accumulated, yet life continued. This pattern aligns with a survival strategy centered on knowledge rather than physical peak. A sharp, short life would not support such a strategy. A long, imperfect life could. In this way, slow development and slow aging are two sides of the same evolutionary constraint. Once the beginning of life expanded, the end could no longer remain compressed. The timeline stretched at both ends. Childhood lengthened, and aging followed. This did not make humans biologically superior. It made them biologically extended. The cost of this extension is visible in every chronic condition and late-life disease that accompanies human aging. These are not malfunctions of a failed design. They are the predictable consequences of keeping a fragile system running longer than it was ever meant to. Understanding this helps dissolve the idea that human longevity is a simple triumph. It is a necessity shaped by dependence, learning, and time. The next step is to look at how this extended development interacts with the brain itself, and why a brain that learns slowly also requires a body that ages slowly. The final layer of this axis is to reunite the body and the brain as a single system stretched across time. A brain that learns slowly cannot function inside a body that ends quickly. Knowledge that takes years to accumulate becomes biologically meaningless if the organism does not survive long enough to apply it. This creates a deep evolutionary constraint. Once learning, memory, and adaptation through experience becomes central to survival, the length of life must expand to accommodate them. Time stops being a luxury and becomes a requirement. The human brain did not simply grow larger compared to other animals. It became more plastic, more dependent on prolonged interaction with the environment. Plasticity allows learning, but it also demands protection. A flexible brain needs years of stable energy supply, social support, and reduced exposure to fatal risk. This is why human childhood is unusually long and human adolescence unusually extended. These stages delay full independence and reproduction, increasing vulnerability rather than reducing it. From a short-life evolutionary perspective, this would appear maladaptive. To compensate for this vulnerability, something else had to change. The body could no longer follow a fast, disposable life pattern. It had to remain viable long enough for the brain's slow development to produce a return. Aging, in this sense, is not a process that suddenly begins in old age. It is the downstream consequence of a life plan that started slowly at the very beginning. When the opening stages of life are extended, the closing stages are pulled outward as well. This does not mean that evolution planned for old age or valued the elderly body. It means that once the brain required decades rather than years to reach full functional value, the body could not simply be discarded immediately afterward. It had to persist, even as its components wore down. This is why human aging feels like gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. The body is held together just long enough to support a system that unfolds over time. Importantly, this persistence does not imply internal harmony. The brain and the body age at different rates. Cognitive abilities may remain relatively stable while physical strength declines, or physical capacity may persist while memory and processing speed change. This mismatch is not an accident. It reflects the fact that longevity was never finely tuned. It was tolerated. The body was not redesigned to perfectly match the brain's extended timeline. It was simply kept alive alongside it, using maintenance systems that were originally meant to function for much shorter spans. This creates tension throughout the human lifespan, as systems optimized for different timescales coexist within the same organism. Wear accumulates unevenly. Regulation becomes imperfect. Decline unfolds slowly rather than cleanly. Seen this way, slow aging is not a feature added late in evolution as a reward or advantage. It is the shadow cast by slow development and slow learning. The human body ages slowly because it cannot afford to end quickly without undermining the very strategy that allowed the species to survive in the first place. Once survival depended on memory, shared knowledge, and experience accumulated over years, early disappearance became too costly. This closes the third axis. We began with a fragile body entering evolution, followed its slow development, and traced how a brain that depends on time forced the entire organism to persist beyond its original biological limits. The question that now remains is not why humans age slowly at the individual level, but how this extended lifespan became meaningful beyond the individual. To answer that, we must turn outward, toward the social dimension of human life, where survival no longer depended on solitary bodies, but on groups that carried knowledge forward together across generations. Human survival did not unfold inside isolated bodies. It unfolded inside groups. This marks a quiet but decisive shift in evolutionary logic. Once survival depends on cooperation rather than individual physical performance, the value of a body changes. Strength, speed, and endurance matter less than reliability, memory, and coordination. In such a system, an individual does not need to be biologically complete on its own. It needs to be functional within a network of others. This is where the social dimension begins to reshape the meaning of aging. In most animals, life ends when physical capacity drops below a critical threshold. Once an individual can no longer hunt, flee, or compete, it is removed by the environment. In human groups, that threshold moves. A body that is no longer fast or strong can still contribute in other ways. It can remember locations, recognize patterns, anticipate danger, and guide behavior. These contributions do not peak early, they accumulate slowly. This accumulation makes time valuable in a new way. A long-lived individual becomes a repository rather than a performer. This shift does not require conscious planning. It emerges naturally once cooperation and learning dominate survival. Groups that retain experienced members gain an advantage over groups that lose them early. Over generations, this advantage feeds back into selection. Bodies that persist longer are not selected because they are strong, but because their continued presence stabilizes the group. Decline is allowed as long as participation remains possible. Importantly, this does not eliminate vulnerability. Older individuals are still weaker, slower, and more fragile. What changes is that weakness no longer means immediate removal. The social environment absorbs some of the cost. Food sharing, collective defense, and division of labor reduce the penalty of decline. This creates space for a prolonged aging process. The body does not need to remain optimal, it only needs to remain present. This is a profound departure from the solitary survival model that dominates most of nature. In that model, once performance drops, life ends. In the human model, performance can shift rather than disappear. This does not mean that social life made humans immortal or even healthy in old age. It means that it reduced the selective pressure against late-life persistence. Traits that allow survival beyond peak physical condition are no longer strongly punished. As a result, aging stretches. Decline becomes gradual rather than terminal. It is important to recognize that this process did not require altruism or moral concern. It required only repeated interaction. Individuals who stayed alive longer continued to influence group behavior simply by being there. Their knowledge shaped decisions. Their presence altered outcomes. Groups that benefited from this did not need to understand why. They simply survived more often. Over time, the human life course adjusted to this reality. Childhood extended, learning deepened, and aging slowed. None of this was optimized. It was layered on top of a fragile biological foundation. The body was not redesigned to age well. It was carried forward because the group could afford to carry it. The human body ages slowly because it exists inside a social structure that delays the consequences of decline. This buffering does not erase damage. It spreads it across time. wear accumulates, but life continues. This prepares the ground for a more specific question. If groups can support aging individuals, under what conditions does that support become advantageous rather than merely tolerated? To answer that, we must look more closely at the role of older individuals themselves and how their presence reshaped survival across generations. As human groups became more stable and interdependent, the presence of older individuals began to change the way survival unfolded over time. In small foraging groups, knowledge was not written down or stored externally. It lived inside people. Information about seasons, animal behavior, edible plants, migration routes, and hidden dangers accumulated slowly through direct experience. Losing that information prematurely could be costly. When an experienced individual disappeared, the group did not simply lose a body, it lost a map of the world. This made survival more fragile, especially in environments that were unpredictable or harsh. Over time, groups that retained experienced members longer gained a subtle but persistent advantage. They made fewer mistakes, they avoided known dangers, they adapted more smoothly to change. This advantage did not require elders to be physically strong, it required them to be present. Memory, not muscle, became the valuable resource. This altered the selective landscape quietly but decisively. Aging individuals were no longer immediately expendable once their physical performance declined. Their continued existence increased the odds that the group as a whole would survive. This does not mean that old age was safe or comfortable. Older humans were still vulnerable to injury, illness, and scarcity. What changed was the tolerance threshold. Groups could absorb the cost of supporting non-productive members because the informational return outweighed the energetic expense. Food sharing, cooperative care, and social bonds made this possible. In this environment, natural selection no longer punished longevity as harshly as it did in solitary species. Traits that allowed bodies to persist a little longer were no longer strongly selected against. This gradual shift stretched the human lifespan without ever explicitly selecting for long life itself. Aging slowed not because it was beneficial in isolation, but because it stopped being immediately harmful at the group level. Importantly, this dynamic did not require foresight or planning. No one needed to decide that elders were valuable. The effect emerged automatically. Groups that happened to keep knowledgeable individuals alive longer survived more often. Their social patterns repeated. The human life course began to include a longer post-reproductive phase, not as a design goal, but as a tolerated outcome. This tolerance had consequences. When bodies persist beyond their peak, internal damage has time to accumulate. Degeneration, chronic conditions, and gradual decline become visible. In other species, these processes are hidden because life ends sooner. In humans, they become part of the lived experience. The social environment buffers the external risks of aging, but it cannot eliminate internal wear. As a result, human aging becomes slow, uneven, and prolonged. It is neither clean nor efficient. It reflects a compromise between biological fragility and social support. This compromise reshaped the meaning of survival. Success was no longer measured solely by individual reproduction. It became tied to group continuity across time. Older individuals contributed to that continuity simply by existing within the group's memory network. Their presence anchored knowledge and stabilized behavior. This stabilized environment, in turn, made it possible for slow development and slow aging to coexist. The human lifespan expanded not because the body became stronger, but because the group became more forgiving. Aging bodies were carried forward by social structures that reduced the cost of decline. This reinforces a recurring theme. Human longevity is not a story of biological optimization. It is a story of biological extension enabled by social context. The body ages slowly because it is no longer alone. It is embedded in relationships that soften the immediate consequences of weakness. This prepares us for the next step in the argument. If older individuals became valuable as carriers of knowledge, then aging did more than simply become tolerated. It began to shape survival actively. To understand how, we must examine the specific roles older humans played, and how those roles fed back into the evolution of long life. The final step of this axis is to understand how aging shifted from being merely tolerated to becoming functionally integrated into human survival. Once older individuals remained present within groups, their roles began to crystallize. They were no longer just survivors of time. They became reference points. In environments where written records did not exist, continuity depended on living memory. Older humans carried patterns that could not be reconstructed quickly. When rivers flooded, which plants became toxic in drought, how animals behaved during rare climate shifts, and which social alliances reduced conflict. These patterns emerged only over long spans. A short life could not capture them. As a result, aging bodies quietly transformed into stabilizing forces. This did not mean elders were leaders in a formal sense. Authority was not required. Presence was enough. Their recollections influenced decisions, guided movement, and reduced uncertainty. Groups that lost this stabilizing layer became more vulnerable to rare but devastating mistakes. Over time, this created a feedback loop. The longer individuals lived, the more knowledge they carried. This loop did not remove biological decline. Physical weakness no longer meant immediate irrelevance. Cognitive presence could outlast physical peak. This is a critical distinction. In most animals, cognition and physical capacity peak together and decline together. In humans, they separate. This separation allows aging to stretch. The body declines while the mind can still contribute. Evolution did not design this separation deliberately. It emerged because once survival relied on shared knowledge, eliminating aging individuals became costly. The social system absorbed their weakness and extracted their experience. This altered the selective environment in subtle ways. Traits that allowed individuals to survive longer, even imperfectly, were no longer filtered out as aggressively. Aging slowed, not because it was selected for, but because it was no longer selected against. Importantly, this process had limits. Social support could reduce external threats, but it could not repair internal damage. Tissues still wore down. Disease still emerged. The difference was timing. These processes unfolded slowly, across years or decades, rather than ending life abruptly. Human aging became a drawn-out negotiation between biological decay and social buffering. This negotiation is unstable by nature. It produces long lives, but not necessarily healthy ones. The body persists in a state of partial function, supported by others, while internal systems drift toward failure. This is why aging feels like imbalance rather than closure. The organism remains alive while its parts lose coordination. Seen from this angle, human longevity is inseparable from human society. Remove cooperation, food sharing, and collective care, and the slow aging body becomes unsustainable. The human lifespan expanded because the group could carry individuals through periods of decline. It implies that aging became compatible with survival once the unit of survival shifted from the individual to the group. This completes the fourth axis. We have moved from solitary biology to social continuity, and seen how aging bodies became integrated into a collective system that values memory over performance. The extended human lifespan is not the triumph of the body, but the consequence of belonging. To move forward, we must now ask a sharper question. If older humans became valuable not just as survivors but as contributors, what specific evolutionary advantage did their presence create? Answering that requires a closer look at the role of older generations in shaping the survival of the young and how that role transformed the trajectory of human aging. The fifth axis begins by narrowing the focus from groups as a whole to a specific evolutionary pattern that reshaped human aging. the survival of the young. In most species, parents invest heavily in offspring only until those offspring can function independently. Once that point is reached, continued investment offers diminishing returns. In humans, this pattern changes. Children remain dependent for an unusually long time. They require food, protection, teaching, and emotional regulation well beyond early childhood. This extended dependence creates a problem. Parents alone often cannot carry the full cost, especially in environments marked by scarcity, illness, and physical exhaustion. Survival, therefore, does not rest solely on the strength of parents. It rests on the presence of additional caregivers. This is where older generations quietly enter the evolutionary equation. Individuals who have passed their reproductive years still possess energy, attention, and experience. When they contribute to caring for the young, they increase the chances that those young will survive. This effect does not require formal roles or deliberate planning. It emerges naturally whenever older individuals remain alive and socially connected. Even small contributions matter. Extra food gathered, children watched while parents forage, knowledge shared about danger or nutrition. Each of these reduces the risk faced by the next generation. Over time, groups that retained older individuals gained a measurable advantage in offspring survival. This advantage feeds directly into natural selection. Genes carried by those groups spread more reliably. Importantly, the benefit does not depend on elders being physically strong or productive in the conventional sense. A body that can persist beyond peak physical capacity still has value if it can support younger lives. This reframes aging once again. The post-reproductive body is no longer biologically irrelevant. It becomes indirectly reproductive. Its continued existence improves the survival of related offspring. From an evolutionary standpoint, this creates a new pathway for selection. Longevity is no longer neutral or harmful. It becomes conditionally beneficial, not because old age itself produces offspring, but because it stabilizes the environment in which offspring grow. This does not mean that evolution selected directly for long life in elders. It means that selection against late life survival weakened. Bodies that could last longer without immediate failure were no longer filtered out as strongly. Aging slowed as a consequence. The body was allowed to persist, even in a state of decline, because its presence increased group fitness. This dynamic helps explain why humans exhibit a long post-reproductive lifespan that is rare among mammals. In most species, individuals that stop reproducing quickly disappear. In humans, they remain. Their survival reshapes family structure, caregiving patterns, and social bonds. This, in turn, feeds back into the demands placed on the body. Systems that allow survival beyond reproduction are maintained longer. Damage accumulates, but life continues. This is not a story of biological generosity. It is a story of shifted priorities. The unit of selection subtly expands from the individual to the kin network. Aging bodies persist not for their own sake, but because they support the survival of others. This support does not eliminate decline. It stretches it across time. The result is slow aging paired with long dependency. Understanding this prepares us to examine a specific hypothesis that captures this pattern clearly, one that focuses on the role of grandparents in human evolution and why their presence may have altered the trajectory of human lifespan more than any other single factor. One of the clearest ways to understand this shift is through what researchers later described as the grandparent effect, but the pattern itself can be observed without naming it. In early human groups, mothers faced a unique constraint. Human children required care for many years, yet mothers could not simply delay reproduction indefinitely. If they waited too long between births, population growth slowed and groups became vulnerable. This created a tension between having children close together and being able to care for them adequately. In such conditions, the presence of additional caregivers became critical. Older individuals, particularly those no longer bearing children themselves, occupied a unique position. They were free from the biological costs of pregnancy and early childcare, yet still capable of contributing time, energy, and experience. Their involvement changed the balance. When older individuals helped feed, protect, and supervise children, mothers could reproduce again without dramatically increasing the risk to existing offspring. This increased the overall reproductive success of the group. Importantly, this benefit did not arise because grandparents were exceptional caregivers. It arose because they were available. Their continued survival reduced the burden on parents and stabilized family units. Over time, this stability translated into higher survival rates for children and more consistent transmission of genes. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a powerful effect. Any trait that slightly increases the likelihood that offspring survive to adulthood can spread rapidly. When the presence of older individuals produces that effect, longevity stops being a biological liability. It becomes a conditional advantage, not an advantage for the individual body, but for the genetic network to which that body belongs. This reframes the meaning of post-reproductive life. In most species, life after reproduction contributes little to evolutionary success. In humans, it can contribute indirectly and substantially. This does not require conscious caregiving strategies or emotional bonds as we understand them today. Simple actions are enough. Sharing food, watching children, passing on practical knowledge, or simply reducing the workload of parents can shift survival probabilities. Even small reductions in risk matter when childhood mortality is high. Over generations, groups that retained older individuals longer outperformed groups that did not. Bodies that could survive past their reproductive years without catastrophic failure were no longer strongly penalized. Aging slowed as a side effect of this relaxed pressure. The body was allowed to persist, even as it accumulated damage, because its continued presence improved outcomes for others. This process also explains why human aging is often accompanied by prolonged periods of partial function rather than sharp decline. There was no requirement for elders to remain physically optimal. They only needed to remain alive and socially integrated. As long as they could contribute something, their existence had value. This tolerance allowed maintenance systems to operate longer than originally intended, without being fully optimized for long-term performance. The result is a long post-reproductive lifespan marked by gradual decline rather than sudden failure. It is important to emphasize what this explanation does not claim. It does not claim that humans evolved to age gracefully, or that old age was selected because it was healthy or comfortable. It claims that old age became evolutionarily acceptable because it increased the survival of the young. The benefit flowed forward, not backward. The aging body was useful not for itself, but for what it made possible in others. This distinction matters because it explains why human longevity is paired with vulnerability. The body persists longer, but it does so imperfectly. Wear accumulates. Systems weaken. Aging stretches because it is tolerated, not because it is solved. This understanding sets the stage for a deeper question. If older individuals improved survival primarily through supporting the young, then aging did more than extend life. It reshaped the structure of human families and altered the rhythm of reproduction itself. To see how profound that change was, we must next examine how intergenerational dependence transformed the entire human life cycle. The final part of this axis is to step back and observe how intergenerational dependence reshaped the entire rhythm of human life. Once older individuals contributed to the survival of the young, reproduction was no longer a strictly individual event. It became distributed across time and across people. Parents were not the only ones responsible for raising children. The burden was shared, and this sharing altered how long individuals needed to remain alive for their existence to matter. Survival was no longer measured only by whether one reproduced, but by whether one helped reproduction succeed. This subtle shift changed the evolutionary meaning of aging. A body that persisted beyond its reproductive years was no longer biologically silent. It continued to influence outcomes indirectly. In this context, longevity became woven into family structure rather than individual performance. Children grew up surrounded by multiple generations. Knowledge, care, and protection flowed sideways and forward, not just downward. This structure reduced the volatility of early human life. When one caregiver failed, others could compensate. When conditions worsened, accumulated experience helped groups respond without starting from nothing. Over time, this stability favored longer lifespans not because long life was efficient on its own, but because it supported a system that relied on continuity. Aging bodies became part of that system. They were not optimized components, but they were necessary ones. This necessity did not erase biological limits. Older individuals still declined. Strength faded. Sensory systems weakened. Illness became more likely. What changed was the consequence of that decline. Weakness no longer meant immediate exclusion from survival. It meant a shift in role. As long as an individual could still participate in some capacity, their continued existence retained value. This is why human aging is often marked by long periods of reduced but not eliminated function. The body is allowed to persist in an in-between state because the social system can absorb imperfection. This tolerance has a cost. Internal damage accumulates for longer periods. Degenerative processes unfold slowly instead of being cut short. The human lifespan expands, but so does the visible burden of aging. Chronic conditions become common. Decline becomes familiar. This is not a flaw layered on top of longevity. It is inseparable from it. A body that is permitted to last longer will inevitably reveal more of its weaknesses. Evolution did not correct these weaknesses because doing so was not necessary for reproductive success at the group level. The benefit of extended survival came from presence, not from health. As a result, maintenance systems were extended, not perfected. Aging slowed, but it did not disappear. This perspective helps explain why human aging feels prolonged rather than purposeful. It is not a stage with a clear function. It is a continuation made possible by interdependence. The body remains because the network allows it to remain. Remove that network, and the slow-aging body becomes fragile again. This underscores a central theme. Human longevity is not anchored in biological resilience alone. It is anchored in social structure. Aging bodies persist because they are carried by relationships that redistribute risk and responsibility. This does not mean that aging was selected because it was good. It means that aging became compatible with survival once survival itself became collective. We have traced how care for the young extended beyond parents, how older individuals became indirectly reproductive, and how this reshaped the human life course. The question that follows naturally is broader. If slow aging emerged from social interdependence within families, how did it scale up as human groups grew larger and more complex? To explore that, we must now look beyond kinship and examine how aging interacted with expanding social structures, shared norms, and early forms of human organization. As human groups expanded beyond close kin, the social logic that supported slow aging did not disappear. It scaled. Small family units gradually connected into larger bands, networks, and early communities. With this expansion came a new requirement: coordination across many individuals who did not share the same immediate genetic interests. Survival increasingly depended on shared norms, repeated interaction, and predictable behavior. In such systems, stability becomes valuable, not stability of environment, which remained unpredictable, but stability of social expectations. Older individuals played a quiet role in providing that stability. They embodied continuity. In groups where membership shifted through birth, death, and migration, long-lived individuals served as anchors. They remembered agreements, conflicts, alliances, and boundaries. Instead of rediscovering norms through repeated conflict, groups could rely on accumulated experience. This reduced internal friction and increased group cohesion. Cohesion, in turn, improved survival in competitive landscapes, where groups competed with other groups rather than isolated individuals. In this context, aging bodies gained a new form of value. They were no longer useful only within families. They contributed to the persistence of group identity itself. This does not imply formal leadership or hierarchy. Influence emerged simply through duration. Individuals who had lived longer had seen more outcomes. Their expectations shaped group behavior, often implicitly. Younger members adjusted their actions in response to these expectations because doing so reduced uncertainty. Over time, groups that retained such stabilizing figures functioned more smoothly. They coordinated movement, resource use, and conflict resolution with fewer costly errors. This advantage did not require elders to be strong or productive in physical terms. It required them to be present long enough to embody continuity. As groups grew larger, the cost of losing continuity increased. When experienced individuals disappeared too quickly, groups fragmented or repeated avoidable mistakes. Selection therefore continued to weaken against late-life survival. Bodies that could persist longer, even in declining condition, were no longer liabilities at the group level. Importantly, this process did not eliminate biological constraints. Older individuals still declined physically and cognitively. What changed was the environment in which that decline occurred. Social structures absorbed some of the risk. Division of labor allowed individuals to shift roles rather than exit entirely. Tasks requiring strength were performed by the young, while tasks requiring judgment, memory, or mediation fell to those with experience. This flexibility reduced the penalty of aging. The body did not need to maintain peak performance to remain useful. It only needed to remain integrated. This integration allowed maintenance systems to operate longer without being fully optimized. Damage accumulated, but life continued. The human lifespan stretched not because the body became resilient, but because the group became tolerant of imperfection. This tolerance had long-term consequences. Once extended, survival became common. Biological processes that normally remain hidden began to surface more frequently. Degeneration, chronic illness, and cognitive decline became visible features of life rather than rare endpoints. Aging became a prolonged phase rather than a brief transition. Yet, from an evolutionary standpoint, this visibility was acceptable. The benefits of continuity outweighed the costs of decline. This reframes slow aging again. It is not simply a byproduct of family care or grandparental support. It is reinforced by the demands of large, cooperative groups that rely on accumulated experience to function. The human body persists because the human group depends on persistence. As long as survival is collective, bodies are allowed to age slowly. To move forward, we must now ask how this collective tolerance interacted with biological limits. If social systems can buffer decline, where do they fail? And what happens when the body is pushed far beyond the conditions under which this tolerance first evolved? Answering that requires examining the mismatch between ancient social buffering and modern longevity. As social buffering allowed bodies to persist longer, it also exposed a boundary that evolution could not easily cross. Social systems can soften external risks, but they cannot rewrite internal biology. They can protect aging individuals from predators, starvation, and immediate exclusion, but they cannot fully prevent the gradual accumulation of damage inside the body. This creates a tension that becomes more visible as lifespan stretches. The longer an organism lives, the more its internal systems must manage error. Cells divide, mutations arise, proteins misfold, and regulatory signals drift. In short-lived species, these problems rarely surface because life ends before they become dominant. In humans, they become unavoidable. Social tolerance allows the body to remain present long enough for these internal processes to reveal themselves. This is why extended lifespan does not translate into extended biological harmony. It translates into prolonged imbalance. Social structures delay the consequences of decline, but they also allow decline to unfold slowly rather than being cut short. From an evolutionary perspective, this was an acceptable trade. However, this tolerance was calibrated for a specific context. Early human lifespans were extended, but not dramatically so. Survival beyond middle age was possible, but not guaranteed. Social buffering allowed aging to slow, but it did not push the body far beyond its underlying limits. The biological systems involved in repair and maintenance were still operating within a range they could manage, albeit imperfectly. As long as lifespans remained within this range, the tension between social support and biological decay remained relatively balanced. Problems emerged gradually, and death often followed, soon after severe decline. The mismatch intensifies when lifespan extends further. As bodies persist into ages rarely reached in ancestral environments, internal conflicts escalate. Processes that were once rare become common. Cancer risk increases as mutations accumulate. Neurodegenerative changes emerge as long-lived neurons struggle to maintain integrity. Immune systems lose precision, oscillating between weakness and chronic inflammation. These are not new failures introduced by modern life. They are ancient vulnerabilities revealed by time. Social buffering did not create them, it simply allowed them to surface. This distinction matters because it clarifies the limits of the social solution. Cooperation can carry bodies through moderate decline, but it cannot indefinitely stabilize systems that were never designed for such longevity. As lifespan stretches, the cost of buffering increases. More care is required. More resources are consumed. The balance that once favored extended survival becomes fragile. From an evolutionary standpoint, this fragility was not fully tested in the past. Selection shaped human aging under conditions where few individuals reached very old age. The system was never optimized for extreme longevity. It was optimized for persistence just long enough to support learning, cooperation, and intergenerational continuity. This explains why human aging feels increasingly strained in later life. The social environment continues to support survival, but the body's internal coherence weakens. Functions decouple. Strength, cognition, and resilience decline at different rates. The organism remains alive, but increasingly unstable. This instability is not a sign that evolution failed. It is a sign that evolution stopped optimizing. Once further improvement no longer increased reproductive success. Social tolerance carried the body beyond the point where biological refinement was necessary. Understanding this helps reframe modern concerns about aging. Many of the challenges associated with long life are not problems waiting to be solved, but consequences of a system extended beyond its original scope. The human body is not malfunctioning when it struggles in extreme old age. It is operating outside the conditions under which it was shaped. This realization prepares us for the next step. If social buffering allowed aging to slow but could not eliminate biological limits, what happens when cultural and technological changes push lifespan even further? To answer that, we must examine how modern conditions amplify the ancient mismatch between social tolerance and biological design. The final part of this axis is to trace how the balance between social tolerance and biological limits becomes increasingly unstable as lifespan extends beyond its original evolutionary range. In early human contexts, social buffering and biological decline moved roughly in step. Bodies aged slowly, social support compensated for weakness, and death often followed not long after severe deterioration appeared. The system was imperfect but coherent. Cultural, technological, and medical changes dramatically reduce external causes of death, while leaving internal aging processes largely intact. The result is not simply longer life, but a widening gap between survival and biological integrity. Social structures continue to carry the body forward, but the body itself drifts further from functional stability. This gap reveals the true nature of slow aging. It was never designed to operate indefinitely. It was designed to operate long enough. Once external threats are minimized, the underlying compromises become visible in ways they never were before. Decline stretches across decades. Periods of partial function lengthen. The organism persists in states that ancestral environments rarely allowed. From an evolutionary perspective, this creates a mismatch. Selection shaped human aging under conditions where very few individuals reached extreme old age. There was no pressure to refine late-life biology, because doing so offered no additional reproductive benefit. Once survival extends far beyond those conditions, unresolved vulnerabilities dominate. Social tolerance continues to enable persistence, but at increasing cost. Care becomes more complex. Resources are consumed for longer periods. The roles older individuals can play narrow as internal systems degrade. This does not negate the evolutionary logic that produced slow aging. It exposes its boundaries. Social buffering can delay failure, but it cannot indefinitely substitute for biological repair. The human body was never meant to remain coherent for such extended spans. It was meant to remain present. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Presence supported learning, cooperation, and continuity. Coherence was secondary. As long as individuals remained alive and socially integrated, the system worked. When coherence becomes the limiting factor, new tensions emerge. Cognitive decline, chronic disease, and functional loss accumulate not because something went wrong recently, but because time finally reveals what evolution never had to fix. This reframing helps clarify why aging feels increasingly fragmented in later life. Different systems fail on different timelines. Muscles weaken, immunity destabilizes, and cognition shifts in non-uniform ways. The body no longer ages as a single unit. It becomes a collection of processes losing coordination. Social structures attempt to compensate, but compensation has limits. The longer life is extended, the more those limits are tested. Importantly, this does not imply that slow aging was a mistake. It was a solution to a specific problem: how to support survival in a species that depends on learning, cooperation, and continuity. That solution worked remarkably well within its original scope. It allowed humans to outcompete other species, transmit culture, and build complex social worlds. Its shortcomings appear only when the solution is pushed far beyond that scope. Modern longevity amplifies an ancient compromise. The body persists long after its design assumptions no longer hold. This completes the sixth axis. We have seen how social buffering scales, where it succeeds, and where it fails. Aging slows because society can carry the body, but biological decay continues beneath that support. The question that now emerges is foundational. If slow aging is the result of a compromise between social survival and biological limits, what exactly did humans trade away to gain so much time? To answer that, we must now turn to the hidden costs embedded in the human body itself and examine what was sacrificed as aging stretched further than nature originally intended. The seventh axis shifts attention inward, away from social structures, and toward the quiet biological costs embedded in the human body itself. Slow aging did not come for free. Every extension of time required compromises at the cellular and systemic level. When bodies persist longer than their original design assumptions, small inefficiencies accumulate into lasting vulnerabilities. In most species, these vulnerabilities remain hidden because life ends before they dominate. In humans, they surface gradually, shaping the lived experience of aging. One of the most important costs lies in how cells manage damage. Every cell constantly faces stress from metabolism, environmental exposure, and internal error. Repair systems exist, but they are limited. They evolved to function long enough to support reproduction and early survival, not to maintain perfect integrity for many decades. As lifespan extends, these systems shift from prevention to management. Damage is no longer eliminated efficiently. It is contained, postponed, or tolerated. This changes the nature of biological maintenance. Aging becomes less about sudden failure and more about slow accumulation. Errors that would once be irrelevant now matter. Mutations build up, proteins lose their precise shapes, cellular communication becomes noisy. These changes do not immediately kill the organism, but they erode coordination over time. Long-lived bodies must tightly control growth, repair, and immune response to avoid internal conflict. This control is never perfect. The longer it operates, the more it drifts. Cells that divide too often risk becoming malignant. Cells that divide too rarely lose regenerative capacity. Immune systems must balance defense with restraint, and over time that balance weakens. Chronic inflammation emerges not as a disease in itself, but as a byproduct of prolonged vigilance. These processes are not accidents. They are the predictable outcomes of keeping systems active beyond their optimal window. In short-lived species, evolution avoids these costs by ending life early. In humans, social buffering keeps the body alive long enough for these tensions to unfold. Slow aging therefore exposes the price of endurance. It reveals that the human body is not a machine built for longevity, but a system stretched by necessity. Importantly, these costs do not appear evenly. Different tissues age at different rates. Some organs maintain function surprisingly well, while others decline early. This unevenness creates the fragmented experience of aging. Strength may fade while memory remains sharp, or cognition may shift while physical capacity persists. Such mismatches reflect the absence of unified optimization. The body was never redesigned as a whole to age slowly. Individual systems were simply allowed to persist as long as they could. This tolerance produces longevity paired with instability. The organism remains alive, but its internal harmony degrades. From an evolutionary standpoint, this degradation was acceptable because it occurred after the traits that mattered most for survival and reproduction had already done their work. There was no pressure to refine late-life biology once social structures reduced the cost of decline. The result is a long lifespan accompanied by vulnerability. Aging becomes a drawn-out negotiation between persistence and failure. Understanding this prepares us to examine specific biological trade-offs that emerge from slow aging, including increased disease risk and systemic fragility. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient consequences of time itself. To see how deep these trade-offs run, we must next explore how prolonged life alters the balance between growth, repair, and degeneration within the human body. One of the most revealing trade-offs of slow aging lies in how the human body balances growth and repair over long periods of time. In early life, growth dominates. Cells divide rapidly, tissues expand, and systems are built with flexibility rather than precision. This flexibility is useful for development and learning, but it carries risks. Rapid division increases the chance of error. To manage this, the body gradually shifts priorities. Growth slows, and repair becomes more important. In a short-lived organism, this shift happens briefly. In humans, it must be sustained for decades. Maintaining this balance for so long places constant pressure on regulatory systems. They must allow enough repair to keep tissues functional, but not so much uncontrolled growth that internal order collapses. Over time, this balance becomes increasingly fragile. One cost of this fragility is a rising risk of uncontrolled cellular behavior. Cells that escape normal regulation can divide excessively, ignore signals to stop, and disrupt surrounding tissue. In younger bodies, such events are often corrected quickly. Surveillance systems identify abnormal cells and remove them. As time passes, these systems lose precision. They become slower, less selective, or overactive in unhelpful ways. This does not happen because the systems are poorly designed. It happens because they were never meant to operate flawlessly for such extended periods. The longer the body persists, the more opportunities arise for small regulatory failures to accumulate. Another cost emerges in the opposite direction. As growth control tightens to prevent disorder, regenerative capacity declines. Stem cells lose flexibility. Tissues repair more slowly. Wounds take longer to heal. This trade-off is unavoidable. Strong growth suppression protects against internal chaos, but limits renewal. Weak suppression enables renewal, but increases instability. In humans, slow aging stretches this compromise across decades. Neither side can fully dominate without unacceptable consequences. The result is a gradual loss of resilience. The body remains functional, but increasingly sensitive to disruption. Illnesses that would be temporary in youth become chronic. Minor injuries have lasting effects. This shift reshapes how decline unfolds. Aging does not arrive as a single failure. It emerges as a pattern of accumulating limitations. Another layer of cost involves coordination between systems. Long-lived bodies rely on precise timing between hormones, immune responses, and neural signals. Over time, these signals drift. Feedback loops lose accuracy. Responses become delayed or exaggerated. The immune system may respond too weakly to real threats and too strongly to harmless stimuli. Hormonal rhythms flatten or desynchronize. Neural signaling slows or becomes noisy. Each of these changes alone may be manageable. Together, they erode the body's ability to maintain balance. This erosion is gradual, making it easy to overlook in the short term but undeniable across decades. Importantly, these costs are not evenly distributed across individuals. Genetics, environment, and chance shape how regulatory systems age. Some bodies maintain coordination longer, others destabilize earlier. This variability is another sign that slow aging was not finely optimized. Evolution did not converge on a single, robust solution. It tolerated a range of outcomes because selection pressure weakened after reproduction. As long as individuals remained alive long enough to support social and reproductive systems, variation in late-life stability was acceptable. This helps explain why human aging appears so unpredictable. There is no single trajectory, there is only a shared exposure to time. Slow aging reveals the cumulative cost of maintaining growth, repair, and regulation far beyond their original scope. The body persists, but it does so under increasing strain. This strain is the price paid for time. To fully understand its consequences, we must now look at how these internal trade-offs translate into the patterns of disease and fragility that characterize later life, and why those patterns are inseparable from the very longevity that made them possible. The final part of this axis is to connect these internal trade-offs to the visible patterns of disease and fragility that accompany long human life. When aging is slow, decline does not concentrate into a single point of failure. It spreads. Different systems weaken on different timelines, creating a landscape of partial breakdown rather than total collapse. This is why late life is rarely defined by one cause alone. Instead, multiple conditions emerge, interact, and amplify one another. From an evolutionary perspective, this pattern is expected. Once bodies persist long enough for accumulated damage to matter, disease becomes a form of aging made visible. Many of the conditions associated with old age are not external invasions. They are internal consequences of time. Cardiovascular disease reflects years of wear on vessels that were never meant to endure constant stress for decades. Neurodegenerative changes reflect neurons that must last a lifetime without replacement. Metabolic disorders arise from regulatory systems stretched far beyond their original operating range. These conditions differ in appearance, but they share a common root. They are expressions of biological systems operating under prolonged strain. In short-lived species, such expressions rarely appear. The organism ends before coordination fails widely. In humans, slow aging allows failure to unfold piece by piece. This creates a body that is alive, but increasingly fragile. Fragility is not simply weakness. It is a loss of margin. Small disruptions produce outsized effects. Minor infections become dangerous. Slight imbalances trigger cascading problems. The organism no longer has excess capacity to absorb stress. This state is not an accident. It is the predictable endpoint of long-term compromise. Repair systems slow. Regulatory feedback weakens. Resilience fades. Yet life continues because external support and social buffering remain in place. From the standpoint of natural selection, this outcome was acceptable. These vulnerabilities appear after the period when selection pressure is strongest. There was no evolutionary incentive to eliminate them as long as they did not interfere with earlier survival and reproduction. As a result, human aging is not protected against disease. It is exposed to it. Disease becomes the language through which aging expresses itself. Importantly, this does not mean that aging is equivalent to disease. Aging is the context. Disease is the manifestation. When internal coordination weakens, the probability of specific failures increases. Which failure appears first depends on chance, environment, and individual history. This is why aging does not look the same in everyone. Some individuals experience cognitive decline early. Others maintain mental clarity but lose physical strength. Others develop metabolic or immune dysfunction. These differences are not evidence of different designs. They are evidence of a single design stretched across variable conditions. Slow aging reveals this variability rather than hiding it. This also explains why attempts to isolate a single cause of aging often fail. Aging is not one process. It is the gradual loss of coordination among many processes. Each system degrades according to its own constraints. The longer life continues, the more these timelines diverge. The body becomes a mosaic of functions operating at different stages of decline. From an evolutionary viewpoint, this mosaic was never refined because it did not need to be. As long as individuals remained present long enough to support social and reproductive structures, late-life fragmentation was tolerated. The cost was borne by the individual body, not by the lineage. This completes the seventh axis. We have traced the hidden biological costs of slow aging from cellular regulation to systemic fragility and disease. These costs are not flaws layered onto an otherwise perfect system. They are inseparable from the time that human life gained. To understand the full meaning of slow aging, we must now step back and ask what this time ultimately allowed humans to build. If aging exposed fragility, it also created opportunity. The next axis will explore how extended lifespan reshaped culture, memory, and the long arc of human continuity beyond biology alone. The eighth axis shifts the focus away from biology and toward what extended time made possible beyond the body. Slow aging did not only expose fragility, it created continuity. When human lives stretched across longer spans, experience could accumulate not just within individuals, but across generations. Memory no longer vanished with each death. It layered. This layering transformed survival from a sequence of isolated lives into a long, connected process. In most species, knowledge dies with the body. Each generation begins again, guided almost entirely by instinct. In humans, slow aging allowed experience to remain present long enough to be transmitted. Skills, habits, stories, and expectations moved from older individuals to younger ones through observation and repetition. This transmission did not require formal teaching. It occurred simply because bodies that carried experience remained in the environment. Younger individuals adjusted their behavior by watching those who had lived longer. Over time, this created a shared behavioral memory that extended beyond any single lifespan. Once survival depended on accumulated knowledge rather than immediate instinct, the past gained influence over the present. Decisions were no longer shaped only by current conditions, but by remembered outcomes. This reduced the cost of trial and error. Groups could avoid mistakes without having to relearn them repeatedly. Slow aging made this possible by keeping witnesses to rare events alive. Droughts, migrations, conflicts, and environmental shifts that occurred only once in a lifetime could still inform future behavior because someone remembered them. This kind of memory cannot exist in short-lived species. It requires time. Extended lifespan therefore reshaped not just individual aging, but the structure of human adaptation itself. Culture began to function as an external memory system, anchored in living bodies. Importantly, this process did not require language in its modern form. Patterns could be transmitted through demonstration, imitation, and shared routines. The presence of older individuals stabilized these patterns. Even as bodies weakened, their role as reference points persisted. This is why human aging and human culture are deeply intertwined. Culture depends on continuity. Continuity depends on time. Slow aging supplied that time. This does not mean that extended lifespan was selected for the sake of culture. Culture emerged because extended lifespan allowed it to emerge. Once present, culture fed back into survival, reinforcing the tolerance for long life. Groups with stronger cultural memory adapted more effectively to changing conditions. They coordinated better. They planned further ahead. These advantages increased group success, indirectly supporting the persistence of aging individuals. This feedback loop strengthened the link between longevity and collective memory. Over generations, human life became organized around long arcs rather than short cycles. Rituals, norms, and shared expectations stabilized behavior across time. Aging bodies were central to this process, not because they were powerful, but because they were continuous. Their presence connected past actions to present decisions. This reframes the meaning of aging once again. Aging is not only a biological process, it is a temporal bridge. It connects different moments of human existence into a coherent sequence. Without slow aging, that sequence would fragment. Each generation would be forced to rediscover its environment anew. Extended lifespan reduced this fragmentation. It allowed humans to operate on timescales that exceeded individual lives. This shift laid the groundwork for cumulative culture, where knowledge builds rather than resets. However, this benefit came with limits. Memory degrades, transmission distorts. No individual can carry everything forward intact. Slow aging does not guarantee accuracy. It only guarantees presence. Even so, presence was enough to alter the trajectory of the species. The human body aged slowly not to preserve itself, but to preserve continuity. This continuity became the foundation upon which more complex forms of social organization and symbolic thought could later arise. To understand how far-reaching this change was, we must now examine how extended lifespan interacted with the growth of shared norms, moral expectations, and early institutions that bound groups together over time. As cultural memory accumulated, human groups began to rely less on immediate biological signals and more on shared expectations that unfolded over time. Extended lifespan allowed norms to stabilize because the individuals who embodied them remained present long enough to reinforce them. In short-lived species, behavior resets with each generation. In humans, behavior thickened. Repeated patterns became traditions. Expectations hardened into rules. These developments required continuity. Not innovation alone. Aging bodies provided that continuity. They carried not only memories of events, but memories of acceptable behavior. Younger members learned not just what worked, but what was expected. By observing those who had lived longest, this gradual reinforcement reduced uncertainty within groups. When individuals know what others are likely to do, cooperation becomes less costly. Trust becomes possible. Extended lifespan therefore contributed indirectly to moral and social stability. This stability improved survival by lowering internal conflict and enabling coordinated action over long periods. They extended beyond immediate kinship to regulate interactions among unrelated individuals. This expansion would not have been possible without persistent reference points. Older individuals served as living benchmarks against which behavior was measured. Their reactions signaled approval or disapproval, guiding group dynamics without the need for constant negotiation. This process did not require formal authority. Influence emerged through duration rather than power. As norms solidified, early institutions began to form. These were not buildings or written laws, but shared practices that endured across generations. Hunting strategies, food sharing rules, conflict resolution methods, and caregiving expectations became standardized. Standardization reduced the cognitive load on individuals. Instead of improvising in every situation, people followed established patterns. This efficiency freed attention for other challenges. Again, extended lifespan made this possible by allowing practices to persist long enough to prove reliable. Aging bodies anchored these practices in time. They embodied the memory of what had worked repeatedly. This anchoring transformed adaptation itself. Human groups no longer adapted only through genetic change or individual trial and error. They adapted through accumulated practice. Culture became a parallel inheritance system, operating alongside biology. Slow aging strengthened this system by ensuring that carriers of practice remained alive long enough to transmit it. Importantly, this did not eliminate variation. Norms could change, but they did so gradually. Abrupt shifts risked destabilizing the group. Older individuals often acted as conservative forces, not because they resisted change intentionally, but because their presence weighted decisions toward continuity. This conservatism had evolutionary consequences. It reduced reckless experimentation while preserving strategies that had already proven effective. In unstable environments, such restraint increased survival. Once again, longevity was not selected because it was ideal in isolation. It was tolerated because it stabilized processes that mattered. However, this stabilization came with tension. As norms hardened, they could also become constraints. Practices that were once adaptive could persist even when conditions changed. Extended lifespan made inertia possible. Older individuals embodied not only wisdom, but also outdated assumptions. This dual role is inseparable from slow aging. Continuity preserves knowledge, but it also preserves error. The same time that allows culture to accumulate also allows misalignment to persist. This complexity is central to the human condition. Aging bodies are not pure assets or pure burdens. They are carriers of both adaptation and delay. Understanding this helps explain why human cultures evolve unevenly. Some practices endure for centuries, others shift rapidly. The balance depends on how continuity and innovation interact within a given context. Slow aging tilts this balance toward continuity by default. This tilt was beneficial in early human history, when stability and coordination were essential for survival. It allowed groups to build shared worlds that extended beyond individual lifetimes. This deepened cooperation and reduced internal volatility. To complete this axis, we must now examine how extended lifespan eventually interacted with symbolic thought and language, transforming cultural memory from embodied practice into abstract systems that could outlast any single body. The final part of this axis is to trace how extended lifespan prepared the ground for symbolic systems that could carry memory beyond the limits of any single body. As long as knowledge lived only in people, continuity depended on their survival. Slow aging made that possible, but it also revealed its limits. Memory fades. Experience distorts. Even the longest life cannot preserve everything intact. Over time, human groups began to externalize what aging bodies had once carried alone. Symbols, rituals, and eventually language allowed memory to be stored outside the individual. This transformation did not replace the role of older individuals. It built upon it. Extended lifespan created the conditions under which symbols could stabilize. People who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat could recognize which stories, gestures, or marks mattered. Younger members learned not only by observing behavior, but by absorbing shared representations of that behavior. In this way, symbolic thought did not emerge in opposition to aging. It emerged alongside it. Aging bodies bridged lived experience and abstraction. They connected concrete memory with shared meaning. Once events could be described rather than merely demonstrated, knowledge could travel further in time and space. However, this capacity still depended on continuity. Symbols only remain meaningful when communities agree on their interpretation. Older individuals often anchored that agreement. Their presence stabilized meaning across generations. They remembered why certain words, rituals, or signs mattered. Without that anchoring, symbols risked becoming empty or misunderstood. Slow aging, therefore, remained essential even as culture became more abstract. It provided the living reference that kept symbolic systems grounded. This interaction reshaped human time. Experience no longer disappeared when a body failed. It could be recorded, repeated, and transmitted through shared systems. Yet the initial impulse towards symbolization arose from the same constraint that produced slow aging: the need to preserve hard-earned knowledge in an unpredictable world. Aging bodies could not hold everything forever. Importantly, this extension did not eliminate biological cost. Bodies continued to age, decline, and fail. What changed was the consequence of that failure. Knowledge no longer vanished entirely with death. This reduced the selective pressure on individual bodies to remain perfect carriers of memory. Longevity could be tolerated even when cognition weakened, because symbolic systems carried part of the burden. This further relaxed selection against late-life decline. Aging slowed, not because the body improved, but because the cost of its imperfection decreased. This creates a subtle feedback loop. Extended lifespan supports culture. Culture reduces the dependence on individual biological integrity. Reduced dependence allows bodies to persist longer without being fully optimized. Slow aging becomes embedded in a broader system that no longer requires biological precision at every stage of life. The human body ages slowly because the human world can carry what the body eventually cannot. This does not mean that aging lost its significance. It changed its role. The individual body became one component in a larger temporal structure. Its decline mattered less because continuity no longer rested entirely on it. This reframes aging once more. Aging is not just a biological trajectory, it is a handoff process. Experience moves from the body into shared systems over time. Older individuals participate in this transfer while they are alive. Afterward, culture preserves fragments of what they carried. This layered continuity allowed humans to operate on timescales far longer than any lifespan. It also introduced new forms of tension. As symbols accumulate, they can outpace lived experience. Traditions can persist without understanding. This creates a gap between memory and meaning. Extended lifespan moderates that gap by keeping living witnesses present, but it cannot close it entirely. The balance between embodied knowledge and abstract memory remains dynamic. This completes the eighth axis. We have seen how slow aging enabled continuity, how continuity supported culture, and how culture fed back into the tolerance for long life. The human lifespan extended not to perfect the body, but to stabilize meaning across time. The next question follows naturally. If slow aging allowed humans to build worlds that outlast individuals, how did those worlds reshape the very pressures that once produced slow aging in the first place? To answer that, we must now turn to how modern environments alter the ancient relationship between time, survival, and the human body. The ninth axis turns toward a reversal in the evolutionary story. The environments that once shaped slow aging no longer exist in the same form. For most of human history, extended lifespan unfolded within narrow limits. Social buffering allowed individuals to live longer, but constant exposure to injury, infection, and scarcity still constrained how far aging could stretch. The body persisted just long enough to support learning, cooperation, and cultural continuity. Modern environments disrupt this balance. Advances in shelter, nutrition, sanitation, and medicine dramatically reduce external causes of death. Humans now survive conditions that would once have ended life quickly. This shift does not redesign the body. It removes the filters that once aligned lifespan with biological capacity. As a result, aging extends into ranges that ancestral environments rarely tested. The human body is carried forward by systems that evolved for survival, not for long-term biological coherence. This creates a growing mismatch between what the body can maintain and how long it is expected to function. In earlier contexts, decline often coincided with death. This exposes the limits of the slow aging compromise. Social structures and technology buffer external threats almost completely, while internal aging processes continue unchanged. The result is not simply longer life, but prolonged vulnerability. Bodies remain alive, while systems that were never optimized for such duration struggle to coordinate. From an evolutionary perspective, this is not a failure of design. It is the predictable outcome of removing constraints without adjusting the underlying system. Selection shaped human aging under conditions where very few individuals reached advanced ages. There was no pressure to refine late-life biology beyond a certain point. Modern survival extends far beyond that point. The internal trade-offs discussed earlier become dominant. Degeneration, chronic disease, and loss of resilience appear not as anomalies, but as the normal expression of time acting on an extended system. This reframes modern aging. Many challenges associated with long life are not new problems created by recent lifestyles. They are ancient compromises revealed by unprecedented duration. The body is not malfunctioning, it is operating beyond the range it was shaped to handle. This distinction matters because it shifts the question from blame to context. The issue is not that humans age poorly, it is that we now age longer than ever before. This longer timeline magnifies every weakness that was once tolerable. Social and technological systems continue to support survival, but they cannot restore biological coordination indefinitely. The gap between survival and vitality widens. Individuals live longer, but often with increasing dependence. This dependence echoes early life in reverse, creating a long arc of vulnerability at both ends of the lifespan. In ancestral settings, these arcs were short. Today, they are extended. This extension reshapes not only individual experience, but social organization. Families, communities, and institutions must absorb prolonged periods of care and support. The same collective buffering that once enabled slow aging now carries a heavier load. This prepares the ground for a deeper question. If modern environments expose the limits of the slow aging compromise, how do they transform the meaning of longevity itself? To explore that, we must examine how extended life in modern contexts feeds back into expectations, identities, and the way humans understand aging as a stage rather than a transition. As lifespan extends further in modern environments, aging begins to shift from a biological process into a social expectation. In earlier human history, few individuals lived long enough for old age to become a clearly defined stage of life. Decline was gradual, but its endpoint arrived relatively soon. Today, aging can occupy decades. This duration reshapes how individuals and societies understand time. Old age is no longer a brief closing chapter. It becomes a prolonged condition with its own norms, roles, and assumptions. This transformation carries consequences. When survival extends far beyond biological design, expectations often follow. Individuals are encouraged to remain productive, independent, and coherent for longer periods than the body can reliably sustain. This creates a quiet tension. Social narratives celebrate longevity as success, yet biological systems continue to erode. The result is a widening gap between what is expected and what is physically possible. Aging bodies are asked to perform beyond their original scope, not because evolution prepared them for it, but because social structures now assume continuity as the default. This assumption changes how decline is perceived. Vulnerability is no longer seen as a natural outcome of time, but as a problem to be managed or postponed. In ancestral contexts, decline was expected and often brief. In modern contexts, it is extended and increasingly medicalized. Conditions that were once terminal become chronic. Support systems keep individuals alive while underlying coordination continues to weaken. This prolongation alters the emotional and social experience of aging. Instead of a clear transition, there is an extended period of adjustment, renegotiation, and uncertainty. The body remains present while its capacities fluctuate. Identity becomes unstable. Roles shift repeatedly. This instability is not simply psychological. It reflects a deeper mismatch between extended survival and biological limits. Another consequence emerges at the collective level. When aging occupies a large portion of the population's lifespan, social systems must reorganize around it. Resources are redirected toward long-term care. Intergenerational relationships change. Younger generations inherit not only knowledge, but responsibility. The same social buffering that once enabled slow aging now carries a heavier and more prolonged burden. This burden was not anticipated by evolutionary processes. Selection did not shape human societies to support decades of late-life dependency. It shaped them to support continuity long enough for culture and cooperation to function. Modern longevity stretches that arrangement. The social tolerance that once allowed aging to slow now risks becoming strained. This strain does not invalidate the evolutionary logic behind slow aging. It reveals its boundaries. Human aging evolved under conditions where extended survival was beneficial but limited. When those limits are removed, the system behaves differently. The body persists, but coherence declines. Society supports survival, but at increasing cost. This interplay reshapes how aging is understood. It becomes less a natural phase and more a managed state. Policies, institutions, and technologies arise to fill the gap between biological capacity and extended time. These interventions do not change the underlying trajectory of aging. They alter its surface. Decline becomes less abrupt but more prolonged. Life continues, but often in fragmented form. This reframing challenges simple narratives about longevity. Living longer does not automatically mean living better. It means living within a different balance of trade-offs. The gains of time are paired with extended exposure to vulnerability. The benefits of continuity are paired with the costs of prolonged dependency. Understanding this helps clarify why modern debates about aging often feel unresolved. They are not disputes about biology alone. They are negotiations about how far social systems can stretch to accommodate bodies that persist beyond their original evolutionary design. This prepares us for the final turn in the argument. If modern environments transform aging into a long social condition rather than a brief biological transition, what does that imply about the future of human aging? To approach that question responsibly, we must return to the core insight of this story. Slow aging was never a gift without cost. It was a compromise shaped by survival needs in a very different world. Recognizing that compromise is the first step toward understanding what aging can and cannot become in the world humans have now created. The final part of this axis is to settle the modern picture of aging into its proper context. When we look at long life today, it is tempting to see it as a failure that needs correction or a problem waiting for a solution. Yet from an evolutionary perspective, what we are witnessing is not malfunction, but exposure. Modern environments have peeled away the external limits that once aligned lifespan with biological capacity. What remains is the underlying structure of the human body, operating far beyond the conditions that shaped it. Slow aging was never designed to support indefinite coherence. It was designed to allow survival long enough for learning, cooperation, and cultural continuity to matter. Once those goals were achieved, evolution had little reason to refine what came afterward. Modern longevity therefore reveals the unfinished edges of that design. Aging stretches, decline fragments, and vulnerability becomes prolonged rather than terminal. This is not because humans suddenly age worse than before, but because they age longer than ever before. This distinction reframes many modern anxieties. The presence of chronic illness, cognitive decline, and long-term dependency in later life does not indicate that human biology is broken. It indicates that human biology is being asked to operate outside its original evolutionary envelope. The slow-aging compromise worked remarkably well within its intended range. It allowed humans to outcompete other species, build cumulative culture, and create societies that spanned generations. Its costs were real, but they remained largely hidden because few individuals lived long enough for them to dominate. Today, those costs are visible because time itself has been expanded. Social and technological systems continue to support survival, but they cannot restore the biological coordination that was never optimized for such duration. As a result, aging becomes a prolonged negotiation rather than a clear transition. Life continues, but often with increasing dependence on external support. This challenges the way modern societies frame success and failure. Longevity is often treated as an unquestioned good, while decline is framed as an enemy. Yet both are expressions of the same underlying compromise. Gaining time necessarily exposes fragility. Extending survival necessarily increases the burden of coordination. The question is not whether humans should age slowly or quickly. That question was answered long ago by the conditions of survival that favored persistence. The modern question is how to live with the consequences of that persistence once it is stretched far beyond its original bounds. This requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking how to eliminate aging, we might ask how to align expectations with biological reality. Instead of treating late-life vulnerability as an aberration, we might recognize it as the visible cost of a strategy that once served the species extremely well. Aging, in this view, is neither a mistake nor a triumph. It is a record. It records the path humans took to survive in an unpredictable world. It records the trade-offs that were accepted in exchange for time. Modern longevity simply reads that record more slowly and more completely than ever before. We have traced how modern environments expose the limits of slow aging and transform it into a prolonged social condition. The story now stands at a turning point. If slow aging was shaped by ancient survival needs and revealed by modern longevity, what remains is to ask what humans ultimately gained by living this long. Beyond biology, beyond culture, beyond social systems, what did extended time make possible in the human story? To address that question, we must now move toward the final axis, where all previous threads converge into a broader reflection on meaning, continuity, and the human relationship with time itself. The 10th axis begins by pulling all previous threads toward a deeper question, one that sits beneath biology, society, and culture alike. Once humans began living long enough to accumulate memory, support others, transmit knowledge, and endure decline, time itself changed its meaning. In most species, time is narrow, life unfolds quickly, purpose is immediate, and the future rarely extends beyond the next reproductive cycle. In humans, slow aging widened time. The future became something that could be anticipated, shaped, and inherited. This shift did not arise from abstract thought alone. It emerged because bodies remained present long enough for consequences to be observed across decades. This altered how humans related to cause and effect. Experience gained weight. Decisions became layered. The passage of time was no longer just survival measured in days. It became continuity measured in lives overlapping one another. Slow aging made this overlap possible. Multiple generations could coexist, observe one another, and adjust behavior accordingly. This coexistence transformed survival into a long-term process rather than a sequence of short trials. From an evolutionary perspective, this was extraordinary. It allowed humans to operate on timescales that exceeded immediate biological urgency. Planning, patience, and delayed reward became viable strategies. These traits would have been meaningless in a short-lived species. They require a body that remains alive long enough to see outcomes unfold. Slow aging provided that body, even if imperfectly. As a result, humans began to act not only for themselves, but for futures they would partially inhabit. This expanded the scope of motivation. Survival was no longer confined to individual lifespan. It extended into shared timelines. Importantly, this did not eliminate risk or uncertainty. It reframed them. Failure could now be learned from rather than simply suffered. Success could be refined rather than repeated blindly. Time became a teacher rather than an enemy. Aging bodies carried lessons forward, not because they were strong. This endurance allowed humans to reflect. Reflection requires memory. Memory requires time. Slow aging quietly supplied both. This is why human societies eventually developed concepts of history, responsibility, and legacy. These ideas are not separable from longevity. They depend on the ability to look backward and forward across extended spans. In a short-lived organism, such perspectives offer little advantage. In humans, they became central to identity. Aging, therefore, is not only a biological phenomenon, it is a temporal condition that reshaped human awareness. The awareness of time passing, of self-changing, of continuity persisting despite decline, became part of the human experience. This awareness is not comfortable. It exposes fragility and impermanence, yet it also enables meaning. Meaning arises when actions are connected across time. Slow aging made those connections visible. Even decline contributed. Watching the body change over years taught humans that life is not static. It unfolds. It demands adjustment. This realization shaped values long before philosophy named them. It influenced how humans cared for one another, planned for scarcity, and remembered the past. From this angle, slow aging did not merely allow humans to survive longer. It altered what survival meant. Survival became participation in a longer story. Individuals were no longer isolated events. They were chapters. This perspective reframes the entire question of why humans age slowly. The answer is not simply that slow aging helped humans live longer. It helped humans live within time differently. It created the conditions under which continuity, responsibility, and shared futures became possible. This does not imply intention or design. It implies consequence. A body that persists long enough inevitably changes how life is understood. This sets the stage for the final synthesis. If slow aging reshaped human experience of time, what does that reveal about the ultimate trade-off humans made? To answer that, we must now bring biology, society, culture, and meaning together, and ask what was truly gained and what was quietly surrendered in exchange for so much time. The second part of the final axis turns from time as continuity toward time as burden. Living longer does not only expand possibility, it also deepens exposure. When life stretches across many decades, experiences accumulate unevenly. Loss, regret, adaptation, and responsibility no longer fade quickly. They layer. In short-lived species, hardship is brief or terminal. In humans, slow aging allows hardship to persist alongside survival. This persistence reshapes the inner landscape of life. Memory becomes heavier. The past does not disappear when conditions change. It remains present, shaping perception and expectation. This is one of the hidden psychological costs of long life. A body that ages slowly carries not only physical wear, but remembered outcomes. Decisions made early can echo late. Mistakes are not erased by death. They are revisited by time. This creates a new form of pressure. Humans must live with consequences longer than any other species. Adaptation therefore shifts inward. Survival is no longer just avoiding danger. it becomes managing continuity. Identity must remain flexible enough to absorb change without breaking. This flexibility is not free. It demands emotional regulation, narrative coherence, and constant adjustment. Slow aging forces the mind to renegotiate meaning repeatedly as the body changes. Youth, strength, and clarity fade gradually, not abruptly. Each transition requires reinterpretation. Who am I now that I am no longer who I was? In short lives, such questions rarely arise. In long lives, they become unavoidable. This is why extended lifespan is often accompanied by reflection, nostalgia, and anxiety about direction. These are not cultural inventions layered onto biology. They are consequences of time stretching beyond immediate survival. Another cost emerges in responsibility. When individuals live long enough to see the outcomes of collective choices, responsibility becomes personal. Environmental change, social decisions, and generational effects are no longer abstract. They are witnessed. A person may live long enough to see a forest vanish, a city transform, or a promise broken. This visibility alters moral weight. Actions cannot be dismissed as momentary when their consequences unfold within one lifetime. Slow aging therefore deepens accountability. It binds individuals to futures they partially inhabit. This can produce care and foresight, but it can also produce fatigue. Carrying responsibility across decades is demanding. It requires sustaining concern long after immediate incentives fade. This endurance is rarely discussed as a cost of longevity, yet it is inseparable from it. There is also a quieter tension between continuity and release. In short-lived organisms, life ends before stagnation becomes a problem. In humans, extended time can trap individuals in roles, narratives, or conditions that no longer fit. Social structures may change more slowly than inner states. The body persists while meaning erodes. This creates a sense of being carried forward without clear direction. Aging slowly means remaining present even when purpose must be rebuilt repeatedly. This rebuilding is work. It is not guaranteed to succeed. From an evolutionary standpoint, these inner costs were not optimized away because they did not threaten survival directly. A mind burdened by memory can still support kin, transmit knowledge, and contribute socially. Selection did not remove psychological strain as long as biological persistence continued. As a result, human longevity exposes not only physical fragility, but existential load. Time gives depth, but it also gives weight. This reframes the final question. Slow aging allowed humans to build continuity, culture, and shared futures. But it also bound them to time in ways no other species experiences. The gain was perspective. The cost was exposure. To understand the full trade, we must now ask how humans responded to this burden. Did extended time merely weigh on the species, or did it also create new ways of interpreting life itself? The final part of this axis will bring the story to its open ending, where no definitive answer is offered, only a reflection on what it means to live long in a body that was never meant to last forever. The final part of this axis does not seek to close the question of slow aging. It deliberately leaves it open. After following the human body from fragile beginnings, through social buffering, cultural continuity, biological cost, and modern mismatch, what remains is not a solution, but a perspective. Slow aging was never a promise of comfort or mastery. It was an outcome of survival under specific constraints. Humans did not gain time because time was good. They gained time because survival began to depend on continuity rather than speed. What that time ultimately became was not predetermined. It unfolded alongside human awareness. Living longer forced humans to confront change within themselves. The body altered gradually, revealing that identity is not fixed. Responsibility extended, making the future something one might personally witness rather than abstractly imagine. These experiences are not side effects. They are the lived texture of long life. Slow aging made humans the only species that must repeatedly adjust to being the same person across radically different internal states. This creates a tension unique to our lineage. Continuity is preserved, but coherence must be renegotiated. Meaning cannot be assigned once and kept. It must be rebuilt as circumstances shift. In this sense, slow aging did not simply extend life. It transformed life into an ongoing process of interpretation. Each stage inherits the outcomes of the previous one. Youth hands its decisions to maturity. Maturity hands its compromises to old age. There is no clean reset. Time binds these stages together. This binding is both the gift and the burden of human longevity. Evolution did not design the human body to resolve this tension. It only made it possible. The rest unfolded through culture, narrative, and reflection. Humans responded to extended time by creating stories, rituals, philosophies, and systems of meaning that help carry what biology alone cannot. These creations do not eliminate aging or its costs. They give structure to endurance. They allow individuals to situate themselves within a longer arc, even as their bodies decline. In this way, slow aging reshaped not only survival, but understanding. Humans became a species that lives in dialogue with time. The body records time through wear. The mind records it through memory. Society records it through tradition. None of these records are complete or accurate on their own. Together, they form the human experience of aging. This experience is not uniform. It varies by context, support, and chance. Humans live long enough to see themselves change. That alone distinguishes them from almost every other animal. This distinction carries no inherent conclusion. It does not declare that long life is better or worse. It reveals that long life demands something different. It demands adjustment rather than optimization, acceptance rather than resolution. That exposure allowed culture to grow, responsibility to deepen, and meaning to stretch beyond immediate survival. It also ensured that fragility, loss, and uncertainty would be prolonged rather than brief. The trade was never hidden, it was simply revealed slowly. This brings the entire narrative to its resting point. Humans age slowly not because their bodies are superior, but because their way of surviving made time unavoidable. That time shaped biology, society, and awareness together. What remains unresolved is not a scientific gap, but a human one. If the body was never meant to last this long, and yet it does, what should be done with the time that was gained? There is no evolutionary answer to that question. It does not explain how it should be lived. That question is left to each generation and to each individual as they move through a lifespan that is longer, more complex, and more demanding than any body was ever designed to endure. The third part of this axis must do one specific job. It must close the exploration of time without closing the story itself. Slow aging, seen from this final angle, is neither a solution nor a failure. It is a condition humans learn to live inside. After tracing biology, society, culture, and modern mismatch, what becomes clear is that extended time changed the relationship between humans and their own lives. When the body lasts long enough to witness its own transformation, life is no longer experienced as a single arc. It becomes a sequence of revisions. Identity is not replaced, but reshaped again and again. Each stage inherits the consequences of earlier ones. Youth does not disappear when strength fades. Likewise, old age does not arrive as a separate state. It grows slowly out of what came before. This continuity is the defining feature of human aging. It is also its weight. Slow aging forces humans to remain present, while meanings shift beneath them. The body changes gradually, but expectations often lag behind. Abilities decline unevenly. Roles must be renegotiated multiple times within one life. In shorter-lived species, these tensions rarely arise. Life ends before long-term self-revision becomes necessary. In humans, survival outpaces stability. This creates a unique burden. Living long enough to remember is also living long enough to compare. The present is constantly measured against the past. Loss is not just experienced once, it is revisited through memory. Achievement is not final, it is reinterpreted as circumstances change. Slow aging therefore exposes humans to time as an active force rather than a background condition. Time becomes something that shapes identity from within. This is not an advantage in the biological sense. It offers no protection against decline. Instead, it introduces reflection. Reflection allows learning, but it also magnifies regret and uncertainty. Evolution did not select for these experiences directly. They emerged because bodies remained alive long enough for them to occur. What humans did with that exposure was not determined by biology. It unfolded through culture, narrative, and shared meaning. Stories, beliefs, and rituals emerged as ways to organize extended time. They did not stop aging, but they helped interpret it. They provided continuity when the body could not. In this sense, slow aging did not grant mastery over time. It forced engagement with it. Humans became the only species required to live with the awareness of long-term change while remaining the same individual. This awareness is uncomfortable, but it is also generative. It allows responsibility to extend across decades. It allows care to be directed toward futures one might still witness. It allows the past to inform the present in ways no instinct can replicate. Yet none of this resolves the underlying tension. The body continues to age imperfectly. Dependence often returns at the end of life, mirroring the vulnerability at the beginning. Slow aging stretches this arc, but it does not smooth it. What it offers instead is time to notice the arc itself. This is the quiet outcome of human longevity, not control, not optimization, but awareness. Awareness of change, of continuity, of limitation. This is why slow aging cannot be fully framed as success or failure. It is the condition that made humans conscious of living within time. This closes the 10th axis properly. The question it leaves behind is not scientific, but human. If aging slowly exposed us to time in this way, then the final question is no longer why humans age slowly, but what remains to be done with the time that was gained. That question cannot be answered by evolution. It belongs to the next and final axis. The final axis begins by returning to the question that has quietly guided the entire journey. Not how humans age, and not how long they live, but why this strange pattern of slow aging became inseparable from being human at all. After moving through biology, social survival, culture, modern mismatch, and the inner weight of time, one thing becomes clear. Slow aging was not an isolated trait. It was the condition that allowed all other human traits to remain connected across time. Without it, learning would reset too quickly. Cooperation would fracture. Culture would thin and disappear. What looks like longevity from the outside is, from the inside, continuity under strain. The human body did not evolve to be timeless. It evolved to remain present long enough for meaning to accumulate. This reframes the entire story. Humans did not gain slow aging because they defeated nature. They gained it because they entered a way of surviving where disappearance became more costly than decline. Once survival depended on memory, relationships, and shared worlds, time could no longer be compressed. The body had to endure, even imperfectly. This endurance is what made humans different. It allowed one life to overlap with another, and another, creating a living bridge between past and future. In most animals, life is a closed loop. In humans, life became an open sequence. Each generation inherited not just genes, but unfinished processes. Knowledge was passed forward. Mistakes lingered. Responsibilities accumulated. Slow aging made these transfers possible. It also made them unavoidable. The cost of this arrangement was never hidden. Bodies weakened, minds changed, dependence returned late in life. Yet the species persisted because what was lost in individual efficiency was gained in collective continuity. From an evolutionary perspective, this was a workable trade. Not a perfect one, but a sufficient one. Over time, humans came to inhabit a strange position. They lived long enough to remember beginnings and anticipate endings, but not long enough to escape decline. This middle position shaped how humans understood themselves. Identity became something that stretches rather than something that completes. Life became something that unfolds rather than something that resolves. Aging, therefore, is not simply the erosion of youth. It is the visible trace of a species that could not afford to start over too often. Every wrinkle, every slowing step, every fading ability marks a body that was kept alive because its continued presence mattered more than its optimal function. This does not romanticize aging. It explains it. Slow aging is not kindness written into biology. It is obligation written into survival. The body stays because leaving too early would break the chain. Modern life often obscures this origin. Longevity is celebrated as progress, while decline is treated as failure. Yet both arise from the same source. Time was gained, and with it came exposure. Exposure to loss, to memory, to responsibility, to comparison with one's former self. These experiences are not errors in the system. They are the lived cost of continuity. Understanding this does not remove discomfort, but it grounds it. Aging feels heavy because it carries more than the present moment. It carries accumulated time. This is the foundation upon which the final reflection must rest. Humans age slowly, not because their bodies are strong, but because their way of surviving made time unavoidable. That time reshaped biology, society, culture, and inner life together. What remains now is not an explanation to be finished, but a question to be held. If slow aging bound humans to time so deeply, then the meaning of a long life is not found in extending it further, but in understanding what continuity asks of those who live inside it. The second part of the final axis deepens this reflection by looking at what continuity demands from those who live inside it. If slow aging allowed humans to remain present across long spans, it also required them to carry what presence entails. Continuity is not neutral. It binds moments together, but it also prevents escape. In a short life, many consequences dissolve quickly. In a long life, they persist. Relationships endure, sometimes beyond their natural ease. Choices made under one set of conditions must be lived with under another. The self becomes layered, carrying earlier versions forward rather than replacing them. This layering is one of the quiet costs of slow aging. Humans do not simply move from stage to stage. They accumulate stages. The child remains within the adult as memory. The adult remains within the elder as expectation and regret. It is something humans learn to endure. From a biological standpoint, persistence was enough. From a lived standpoint, persistence required interpretation. Humans responded to this demand by developing ways to make sense of extended time. Narrative became essential. Lives were understood not as collections of moments, but as stories that connect beginnings to endings. This storytelling impulse is inseparable from longevity. Only a species that lives long enough to reflect on change needs narrative to maintain coherence. Without it, continuity would feel unbearable. Stories do not erase decline. They place it within a larger arc. In this way, culture did not merely transmit knowledge. It helped individuals survive their own duration. Another demand of continuity is care. When life stretches, vulnerability does not disappear. It redistributes. Strength peaks early. Dependence returns late. Slow aging creates a long corridor between these states, but it does not eliminate them. This means that care must flow across generations, not as an exception, but as a structural necessity. Humans became a species that must care for both beginnings and endings. This requirement shaped moral intuitions long before formal ethics. The presence of aging bodies made neglect visible. Decline unfolded slowly enough to be witnessed. This visibility demanded response. It is not accidental that humans developed strong norms around caregiving. They emerged because continuity made vulnerability unavoidable. A body that remains present while weakening asks something of others simply by existing. That request is not spoken. It is structural. Slow aging, therefore, embedded obligation into human life. This obligation is often experienced as burden, but it is also what sustains the chain of continuity. Without care, extended lifespan would collapse back into short, solitary survival. Another demand lies in patience. When outcomes unfold over decades, immediate reward loses dominance. Humans learn to wait, to plan, and to accept delay because they might still be there when results appear. This capacity reshaped how humans interacted with environment and with one another. It enabled agriculture, long-term cooperation, and institutions that outlast individuals. Yet patience has a cost. Waiting requires endurance. It requires living with uncertainty for long periods. Slow aging made this possible, but not comfortable. The human nervous system was not designed for endless anticipation. Anxiety and restlessness are the shadows of patience extended too far. Once again, evolution did not resolve this tension. It allowed it. The body and mind were left to manage time as best they could. This reveals the true nature of the human trade. Slow aging did not grant harmony, it granted duration. What humans built within that duration was not guaranteed. It required effort, adaptation, and shared meaning. Continuity is powerful, but it is demanding. It asks individuals to live with memory, responsibility, care, and patience all at once. These demands shape the texture of human life far more than raw lifespan numbers ever could. Understanding this brings us closer to the final resting point of the story. If slow aging bound humans to continuity and imposed these demands, then the final question is not how to escape aging, but how to inhabit it wisely. That question cannot be answered by science alone. It leads us to the final part of the final axis, where the story does not conclude with knowledge, but with an open space for reflection. The final part of the final axis is not meant to explain anything new. It is meant to let the question rest. After following the long path of slow aging from fragile bodies to social survival, to culture, to modern mismatch, to inner burden, what remains is a simple but unsettling realization. Humans did not evolve to age slowly in order to be comfortable. They aged slowly because their way of surviving made time unavoidable. Once learning, care, memory, and continuity became central, life could no longer be short without breaking the chain. The body stayed, even as it weakened, because leaving too early would cost more than enduring decline. This is the condition humans inherited. To live long enough to remember, to witness change, to outlast mistakes, and to remain present while meaning shifts. Slow aging gave humans something no other species carries in the same way: a long awareness of becoming weaker, becoming different, becoming responsible for futures that one may partly see and partly never reach. This awareness is heavy, but it is also what allowed humans to step out of immediate survival and into reflection. Aging slowly did not give humans answers. It gave them time in which questions could form. What to protect? What to pass on? What to let go? What to endure? Evolution explains how this time appeared, but it does not explain how it should be used. That task was never biological. It was always human. And so the story ends where it must end, not with a conclusion. If the human body was never meant to last this long, yet it does, then the meaning of a long life cannot be found in extending it further. It must be found in how one lives inside the time that was gained.